So many students have asked me, usually quite agitatedly and earnestly, what is the difference between a rock and a stone? I answer them, a stone you keep and a rock you throw away. Now, this may seem very, odd. But in fact, this is pretty much how it works. As an archaeologist, you will find that when you're digging away and you pick up something made of rock, but has not been worked, it's still a rock. But if you can see that a human hand has modified it in some way, it becomes stone. It becomes worked stone. And so you keep it, and you draw it, and you publish it. So the difference between a rock and a stone is you keep a stone, but a rock, you throw it away. So sources of stone, of course, are where there is rock. This is a very interesting source of rock. This is Aswan. Remember the Aswan granite? Well, this is a obelisk that was supposed to be the tallest ever made, but it got a big crack in it, and so they gave up. But it's still quite interesting, very popular with tourists, and shows you how these things can be extracted. Because all around it are found the remnants of moles. These could actually just be used, just take it in your hand and whack it, but the safest thing would be to attach it to a handle. And in most of these cases, the handles would have fallen off and been lost for a very long time. But probably all of these things had a very simple handle. You just wrap something around it, tie it up, and Bob's your uncle. So there's lots of evidence of how the stone was extracted. Here you can see where all of those mauls, all of those hammers made out of exactly the same material as this, were repeatedly banged away at the rock until it eventually goes away, leaving nothing behind but the stone. You can see again, hundreds and hundreds of man-hours spent on banging the rocks together to get the stone. All completely futile. So here is the geological map of Egypt, and here, if we close it on this area, we can see here is Aswan, and Aswan is actually like all of the cataracts of the Nile. This is the first cataract, which is basically like a rapid, shall we say, sometimes a bit of a waterfall going on. And this is actually some of this Precambrian basement coming up underneath the Nubian limestone, sandstone, and the limestone over that. Aswan, right there. So Aswan is here, but when this became part of the Roman Empire, those Romans then spread down stuff all over the place, like to Syria and Rome itself. Here's some in Syria at Palmyra Tadmor, and you can see it has the same distinctive large potassic feldspar crystals in it. Here in the Forum of Rome, you can see it's here as well, and this large column, and these bits of this column were made of granite imported from Egypt. So why would you import granite from Egypt? Because you can, because you're Romans. This particular column, this is probably an ancient Roman column which was reused in St. Peter's Square. If you go to St. Peter's Square, there's this big thing standing up in the middle of the square with there's an angel on top of it or something. But around it are these bollards to stop people running into the sculpture. And they're all made of different rocks. And they're all probably made of Roman columns. And so there's various types of marble and all other sorts of decorative stone, which have all been pounded up and reused to make these bollards with. So this is another interesting type of rock. This is known as Imperial Porphyry, which was so valuable it was only used for Imperial Royal Byzantine purposes. Like this is the sarcophagus of the mother of Constantine the Great, which was a very important lady. So a porphyry is something with spots. It basically means spots. But this has actually got crystals in it. So this is andesite, which you'll remember as an intermediate volcanic rock. So this is a volcanic rock, but there are crystals actually within the volcanic rock, and so that makes it spotty and very popular. And this comes from Mons Porphyritis, the spotty mountain. And so here, again in the eastern desert, in this Precambrian shield, was this deposit of this very interesting andesite. Now, trade in the Indian Ocean, down here, this is actually my map of research on pottery from all periods, going back to the Neolithic, but a lot of these red ones, or in fact all of these red ones, are in fact from the medieval Islamic period. And they trace, amongst other things, the trade into the Indian Ocean. And the people would come down here to the Indian Ocean from India and from the Middle East to East Africa for a number of very important raw materials. One of them is actually from Madagascar, here. Or here, in fact. So this is Madagascar, and this is the route. There's a number of archaeological sites here, one of which I've actually sampled pottery from. And here are deposits of a type of rock known as Pegmatite, which is a very coarsely grained igneous rock. It's a granitic rock, so it'll have a lot of the usual granitic rock minerals in it, but they're all very, very big. This, for instance, is a pegmatite, and this is 1/2 meter across. And these big pink, this is one big feldspar. So that's a feldspar which is like a quarter of a meter across, and these are very large quartz crystals. And so this is actually the source of these massive pieces of quartz, which became very important as rock crystal, very important rock crystal for making objects with in the medieval period, particularly under the Fatimids in the 12th and 11th century in Egypt, where they imported this beautiful clear quartz and made things out of it. Very nice stuff. So that's a pegmatite. Of course, in Iraq, there's not a lot of rock. Here we can see the Tigris-Euphrates basin. This is all just alluvium, just sediment. Even up here, although it looks a bit more like rock, it isn't actually. This is just more sediment, only a bit older. And so here, the rocks are very rare. And so they will find a rock that has been washed down from the mountains. And of course, as we know, as far as the Mesopotamians were concerned, good things came from the mountains, including rocks. And so if you found a rock, you wouldn't just use it into a fence post or just like lean against it. You would use it to make something very important, like a kuduru, which was a boundary stone. This one's made of limestone. This is 65 centimeters, 1/2 meter high. So that would be quite a big rock. Someone would notice it, use it for something. This is an even bigger rock. This is a big lump of diorite. And again, you can see it's not been quarried out of some mountain of diorite. It's just a big boulder which has been rolling down from the mountains, down the Tigris or Euphrates. And someone came along and said, I know what I could do with that. I could turn that into a stele and write my law code on it. This is the Babylonian ruler. No, actually, this is him. This is a deity. Who wrote his law code on it. very important, very influential, written on a rock that someone just found floating down the Euphrates. Well, it wasn't floating. It's a rock, so it was actually just being washed down the river. So diorite, of course, an intermediate intrusive rock. So here's andesite, like that porphyry, and here's diorite. Of course, this is also why the buildings in Mesopotamia are mostly made of mud. Not very impressive. Whereas the buildings in Egypt are very impressive. And this is partly because of the building stone. And so you can see this is Egypt. This is the geology of Egypt, a simpler map. And so you can see here the red is that Precambrian basement. And it's covered with this very nice sandstone. Actually, the sandstone's not very good for making buildings out of, but there's limestone. There's various types of limestone. And it's all good for making stuff out of. And so these would be put on ships and brought down the Nile, very easy to move around. Here's actually a rock drawing in a quarry site. And here is a map showing a expedition. It's about 1160 BC. It's quite old. And it shows an expedition into the Eastern Desert looking for sources of stone. So studying these sources of stone, as you may have noticed from the maps I've shown periodically, is very important. This is actually Aswan. And so they've been noticing, studying the types of rock that are used in this area and how they were quarried. One of the things they find are these roads. See, these roads are built in order to facilitate the removal of rock to move it down the Nile, where it can be turned into stone, using sleds rather like this. Of course, as you've probably guessed from my talking about the St. Peter's Square, another source of rock is stone. So here we have a stone. This is a work stone. So this is actually, if you look at it carefully, this is a column. It's a Roman column. And this, somebody started carving it into the figure of some nice person with a book. And so they didn't finish it, so it was left. And probably if they finished it, it would have been completely carved away and there'd be no traces of the fact that this is what is known as spolia. Spolia, which is something which had been used before, which you then reuse and carve it into something else. So this, like this, what was probably a column, and in this case it clearly was a column, but this probably was also a column and reused as a source of stone. So working stone, of course, are various techniques which you can determine in the archaeological record, going right back to the Oldowan, where it's just basically banging the rocks together, guys. So after banging the rocks together, we developed more elaborate ways of working stone. And probably most important of these early expressions was the Acheulian hand axe, or biface as it's probably more properly called. Although hand axe is just such a nice word, and is quite useful because it's an axe that goes in your hand. So these seem to have never been hafted. You just pick up one end, and if you ever have a chance to hold one of these, they're actually quite tactile. You can actually feel the weight of it, and you can wrap your hand around the sharp end and use the blunt end as a hammer, and you can hold the blunt end and use the sharp end as a knife, and it just works so very well. And what's really cool about these objects is really they're one of our first lines of evidence of design. Because in the older one, if I can just go back that slide, this is quite simple, and you can find these rocks anywhere. These actually come from a context that would suggest they've been made deliberately, and probably there are traces to show that these have been deliberately struck in order to make these edges. Having a rock which is sharp, you can find sharp rocks. And so just working out that if you bang two rocks together, you make a sharp edge is quite simple. I'm sure that wasn't such a great leap. But there is no evidence of this tool in the lump of rock that the person that made this could see. It was just a lump of rock. And they saw in that lump of rock this tool. So it shows you that the cognitive skills of that human being was to see beyond the rock, to see within it. And it talks about all sorts of things, about how humans can see things that aren't really there. So after that, they developed the Levallois technology, which is an early way of creating from a core a flake to make tools like this. So this is when we start getting, this is actually quite short, it's like 3 or 4 centimeters long, and it's probably the point of a spear. This is when we start getting a lot more hafting, and so this is probably a spear point. And then we have blades being developed, where you can strike from the core here, these long blades, which tend to be used in tools, and so this becomes even more elaborate. And so this became the lithic technology up until well into the Bronze Age. During the Bronze Age, probably most tools were actually made of stone because bronze was so expensive. So then we have the idea of grinding the stone, and here we have that jadeite axe I showed you some time ago when I was showing you jadeite. This is of course made of a stone which can be easily ground, and so things like jadeite, which is quite hard as a metamorphic rock, it has a certain facility, and the jade tends to be oriented all in the same direction, and so you can orient it. One side is easy to grind, whereas the point is harder, or the edge is harder. And so a lot of other types of rock that are schistose, which have this facility, rather like a shale, will enable you to grind the one side, the sides, but leave a harder edge for the edge of the tool. So for making ground stool receptacles, both of these start at the same time in the Natufian and Neolithic period, where you would have these ground stone axes and ground stone containers, like these very nice mortars and pestles. And you can make that out of any rock, but a very popular rock for making this sort of thing out of are soft rocks. So this is a series of photographs from Hansi Wolf's book, The Traditional Crafts of Persia, of people making bowls out of a chlorite schist. So it's quite a soft material, and this is a very useful type of receptacle for cooking with. And so they made these very popular bowls. And so here you can see this chap is gouging out the inside. So they roughed out the vessel. And now this chap is using a lathe. And so you can see he has a bow here. And so the string goes around the central pivot. And he goes backwards and forwards with the bow. And with his tool here, he works the stone. And so it changed from being just this roughed out block into a usable vessel. So you can see this guy, this is why a reciprocating nature, like with the bow, rather than a modern lathe which just goes around and around and around, is actually in some cases more useful, because these lugs, these handles, you wouldn't be able to do that with a lathe that just goes around and around. Whereas one that goes backwards and forwards, that makes it much easier to make a vessel with a lug, with a handle. And so here you can see that here's this tool in one hand, and he's got the bow in the other. And he's got his feet keeping the work in position. And so he's turning this down, and he seems quite happy here. And he starts getting, I think, kind of annoyed with these people tagging all these photographs. But you can see the way he's working this until eventually they go into the shop. See, and they make lids for them as well. So there's actually a national dish for a part of Iran, I guess it's a regional dish, that is made in these pots. Also in the Yemen, there's a very popular national dish made in pots of exactly this nature. So then you have masons. Of course, the work of masons is very important, and they will be building things. In fact, we'll be talking about buildings later on, built by masons. And here we can see chipping away. So with a big hammer, you might make this to start with. And here you've got this pointy hammer to just chip away at the surface. And then you might have another type of tool for making the surface flat. And we'll be looking at how these things work later on when we're talking at how to see the stuff of building and how to distinguish building styles. And of course you have ordinary chisels. So chisels like this would be very useful for work like this, and all for making sculpture. So sculpture, this is quite an interesting ostrakon. An ostrakon could be a piece of rock, or it can be a piece of pottery, which is flat and used for either writing things on, or this person made these drawings, which were then being transferred in a technique like this, you see, to probably a stele or a wall, maybe entire tomb wall, where these are carved into the limestone. This is a three-dimensional sculpture that someone has started by inscribing what they're going to make. They're going to make a horse, then it broke, and so they gave up. And here's another piece where they started working. See, this is just keep chipping away until they're going to end up trying to have something like this. But they stopped. So it never got to look like this. So there we have it. Rocks and stones. We'll get to sticks later on, of course. But so here we have a human being made of stone. This is a sandstone, probably Nubian sandstone from Egypt. And so you can see how in this hard, resistant material, a human face has been created. And here, this is looks like Aswan granite again, certainly some sort of granite, which has been made into this expressive face. Of course, limestones are much easier. This is a very fine limestone from Egypt. And marble, one of the probably most useful stones for sculpture, used and a favorite with sculptures to this very day. So, that is stone, which of course starts off as rock, but then is chosen to make a thing out of. And this is how you make, well, objects, not things. We don't use the word things. Thank you.